Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, very excited about tonight's show. I say that every week, and it's true every week. I'm always excited about doing this show because I get to never stop learning. And it's really cool for a teacher to always be learning, because that means I have fresh information to keep me excited, and hopefully fresh information to keep you excited. And where we're going to take up is we're going to continue with our discussion of what I'm calling the Roman Chronicle. Now, if you have not heard my show before, let me try to give you a very brief overview of what God Save the King is all about. God Save the King is about the nativity story, but it's not about the traditional nativity story, because the traditional nativity story is a vastly oversimplified, commercially packaged version of the nativity that actually does not stand up to biblical or historical scrutiny. Therefore, really what I'm boiling it down to is I'm saying that the traditional nativity story is basically incorrect. It's pretty much wrong. And that's really too bad, because it has taken on a life of its own. It's become a kind of Christian mythology where every year at quote unquote Christmas time, you can go to any church you want and very safely get a regurgitated version of the nativity story. You know what the story is going to be. You have a pretty good idea what the sermon's going to be about, and you don't have to be challenged, right? But unfortunately, that's not what the nativity really looked like. It only has vague similarity to the real nativity story. Now, why is that? Okay. And why is that important? Well, the reason that happened is because the traditional nativity story actually developed over time. Even though it's highly oversimplified, nonetheless, it developed over time, and to become what it is today. Joseph and Mary on the back of a donkey, arriving in Bethlehem right before she's about to give birth. She gives birth the same day. Then the shepherds show up, and then the magi show up, and then everybody lives happily ever after. And, part of this is due to making it a children's story, making it palatable for children, but it really bears very little resemblance to the legitimate nativity story, which is this truly powerful story. And the reason this is important, very simply, let me screen share with you here. The reason this is important is because we want to be faithful followers of Christ. And in order to do that, we have to be faithful followers, faithful interpreters of Scripture. And this is a drum I've been banging on for a while now, that, see, the Bible is an ancient foreign book written in ancient foreign languages by ancient foreign writers to an ancient foreign audience. And we're not that audience. That's not us. That's somebody else. See, so therefore what this means is that there are things that the ancient foreign writers and the ancient foreign audience would have implicitly understood, because it's part of their culture, that we unfortunately will inherently miss because it's not part of ours, right? Therefore, the job that we have before us is we need to do our best. We need to do our due diligence to try to supply these historical and cultural elements that will help us faithfully interpret Scripture so that we can glean the actual theological message. See, I mentioned a long time ago when I did my television show on God Save the King, I mentioned that I focus a lot on the history, but the goal is the theology. The goal is the theology. I'm not doing this just to tell a cool historical story. I'm doing it so that we can put it in its historical and cultural context, so that then we can draw out of it, well, what would that have really meant? So when it comes to the quote unquote Roman Chronicle, See, the Roman Chronicle is understanding how Roman culture would have played a role in the understanding of the gospel writers, and then also of their audience, and then frankly also of the people who lived at that time. Because remember, Judea at the time of Jesus' birth was a client kingdom of the Roman Empire, and prior to that it had been a vassal of the Greek Seleucid Empire, and prior to that, the Persians, and prior to that, the Babylonians. So you have multiple cultural influences, whether it's Roman, whether it's Syrian, whether it's Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Canaanite, Edomite, all kinds of cultural influences might be in play here that are influencing, once again, the writer and the audience. And see, the audience in particular, whenever somebody writes, they never write exhaustive. That's not how it works. You can't write a 1,000-page book and expect everybody to read it, but you can write a one-page synopsis and get a lot of people to read it. But when you write a synopsis, you really have no choice. You've got to write in such a way that you're relying on things that the audience is going to recognize and that you don't have to explain. Now, if you know you're writing for a foreign audience that doesn't understand your culture, then you do have to explain, and that is clearly not what is going on in the Bible. The Bible is being written, the Old and New Testament for that matter, although we happen to be focusing on the New Testament, the four Gospels, and then the Pauline epistles and the general epistles, plus the book of Revelation to a degree. We're focusing on the New Testament and what it would have meant to those writers and that audience, and what can we, if we can supply some of the history and some of the culture, what can we understand that we probably would have missed? And the nativity story is a great opportunity to practice this principle, because I've pointed out many times over the years, and I do it virtually every episode is just a quick example, the fact about in the Gospel of Luke, where we read that Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem, and that there's quote unquote no room in the inn, according to the King James translation. It is translated in other versions better than it is in the King James. But when we read that word inn, see, our modern Western culture thinks motel. See, we think a commercial traveler's inn, and then we superimpose that understanding on the ancient text, and it changes it completely, and it turns out that it's not correct. We have to understand what the word in, which is not a very good translation, would have meant to the audience at that time, because it happens to be the Greek word kataluma, which would better be translated guest room. And in the Hebrew hospitality culture of that time, that is where people would spend the night when traveling. Is you would walk into the town square, you'd sit down, and then you would wait for a local to approach you and say, do you need lodging for the night? And you'd say yes, and he'd say, come with me, and he would put you in his guest room. See, so that is a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about here, that this is something the ancient writer and the ancient audience would have inherently understood, that we, unfortunately, inherently miss, because it's not part of our culture, but it was part of their culture. Another piece of the puzzle is, when Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem, why did they have to travel to Bethlehem? Because we get this impression from the text that they were required to, right? Notice how it says, and everyone went to their own city, okay? The better way of understanding that is everybody went to where they owned property. If you owned real estate, see, because if you didn't own real estate, you weren't part of the census. Not a Roman census, anyway, right? You needed to own property. So that tells us something. Here you go. Here's something that the writer and the audience would have inherently known that we would have inherently missed, which is that Joseph would have been a landowner. See, and therefore he and his betrothed had to travel to Bethlehem in order to register because he was a landowner. Very interesting. Very interesting. So now today I want to get into some additional information about the Roman Chronicle, okay, that will help us understand all kinds of things about the Bible. I'm actually going to cover several different ideas all simultaneously because we're going to focus in on one particular city in the Bible lands. And in my sharing for today, we're going to focus in on a particular city. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of that city over time. See, and here you go. Because I can inform you about the history of that city over time. And therefore, here you go, the cultural influences of that city over time. Now, when you go to read a Bible story where that city is part of the story, it's going to change your understanding, that you're going to be able to go, oh, whoa, okay. Now I see it differently than I did before because we're adding historical and cultural context that we are not necessarily familiar with, that the ancient foreign writer and the ancient foreign audience would have been implicitly familiar with. So what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the ancient city of Samaria. So the ancient city of Samaria in Hebrew was called Shamron, Shomron, Shamron. And this is most likely because it appears to have derived from either an individual or a clan, or both, because that's usually how that works, of an individual or a clan named Shemer. Okay, and we read in 1 Kings 16 how King Omri of the northern kingdom purchased land to build his new capital of the northern kingdom. Okay, now let me back up very quickly and give you a quick run up to that point. If we start with the United Kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon, the nation of Israel was at its largest geophysically and its most influential economically and militarily. It was a significant, powerful state at that time under Saul, David, and Solomon. But then, if you know your Old Testament history, you're aware that Solomon's son, Rehoboam, messed up. He did not follow his father's advice, and he did not follow the advice of his father's advisors who were there to help him. They were there to serve him. I mean, come on. If you've got Solomon, who's reputed to be one of the wisest men of the world, and he's got advisors, wow, those are people I would listen to, right? But Rehoboam did not listen to those advisors, and as a result, he treated the people poorly. He frankly abused them with overtaxation and things like that, instead of taking it easy on them and frankly getting the people on his side, which is really what it kind of boils down to. He turned the people against him. And then as a result, other leaders rose up in confrontation to Rehoboam, and that is Jeroboam, who rose up and he stood against Rehoboam, and long story short, the kingdom divided. So now you have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was 10 tribes. The southern kingdom was predominantly 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, with the other 10 being in the north. And the north went off and established their own government and their own variation on the religion of the Jews, of Judaism. They modified the religion to suit them. And to a certain degree, they had to. And this is very important for our understanding, because I think there are times when we don't realize how wrong that was. that we think, oh, well, they just modified it a little bit, but they were still essentially Jews and they still worshiped Yahweh and da 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 da. But the problem is, see, and it's no coincidence, man, it is no coincidence that the story of Jesus and the woman at the well occurred in Samaria, the Samaritan woman at the well in the village of Sychar outside of Shechem in the region of Samaria. It's no coincidence, because when they have their conversation, once again, there are times I don't think we realize that Jesus is pretty squarely hitting her between the eyes and saying, yeah, I'm sorry, you're wrong. You're wrong. Salvation is of the Jews. We know what we worship. You, however, no, you got it wrong. See? And that's because they could no longer attend the festivals in Jerusalem, in the place where the Lord put his name, and things like that. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but so quick review. Hebrew Shamron, apparently derived from either an individual or a clan named Shamer, right? Omri, the sixth king of the northern kingdom of Israel, purchased the site from Shamer so that he could build his new capital there. Okay, so Samaria became this central region in the middle of Israel, north-south, with Galilee on the north, Samaria in the middle, and then Judea on the south. And it extended all the way from the Mediterranean to the Jordan Valley, right, with Galilee on the north side, Judea on the south side, and it was this band across the middle, okay? And it essentially, now here, I read conflicting reports, and I got to admit, I didn't have time to really scrub the maps and really figure this out. It either corresponds to the tribal allotment of Ephraim, plus a little bit of Manasseh, and or it corresponds to the tribal allotment of Joseph. Because, see, Joseph's bones are buried in Shechem. So that's interesting, because remember what we talked about last time, and I alluded to it just a few minutes ago today. There's this very profound connection between the people and the land, and there's supposed to be. Remember Abraham and the covenant, and God said, I will give you a land. It's not actually your land, it's my land, but you are going to steward the land for me, or more appropriately, you're going to care for the land for me, right? You're going to take care of the land, which is in English, that's the Greek word, or pardon me, in English, it's the word agriculture, to care for the land. But if you were given a tribal allotment, and then, you as an individual or a family, you own a piece of land, well, that's yours. That's you connecting to the covenant and connecting to God. So that's why people were buried where they were. They made a big deal about transporting people back to their home to be buried there, and things like that. So there's a little bit of confusion whether it corresponds to the tribal allotment of Ephraim, Manasseh, or Joseph, or a little bit of all three. It could be. Like I said, I didn't have time to really scrub the maps and see exactly what was going on. Okay. But after Omri bought the site from Shemer and named his new capital Samaria, as a result, now the region tended to take on the name Samaria as a whole, okay? And that was in the 9th century, if I remember right, is when Omri purchased the site and began building a new city there. It would have been in the 9th century BC. But then in the late 8th century BC is when the Assyrians came through and captured the northern kingdom. And they took a large portion of the Samaritan population captive and scattered them in other parts of their empire, and then brought in foreigners and relocated them and repopulated a big part of Samaria with these foreigners. Now, this is the part of the story that we tend to know. if you're a reasonable student of Scripture, if you had good Bible study in your church, or maybe you went to Bible college, this is the part you're probably aware of, and that this is where the label Samaritan takes upon itself kind of a bad name, is because, well, they're only half Jews, because after all, the Assyrians moved foreigners in there, and then the Jews married the foreigners, and now you've got mixed ethnicity kids, so they're not really Jews, they're only kind of half Jews, quote unquote, right? But then you've got the deportation of legitimate Jews, right? The influx of other nationalities, other ethnicities, the mixing. But then you've got the fact that the Assyrians get conquered by the Babylonians, and then the Babylonians get conquered by the Persians, and then the Persians allow the Jews to go home, right? So a lot of them come back not only to Judea and Jerusalem, but frankly also to Samaria as well. So it stands to reason that many of the captives who considered themselves Sumerians, or frankly just considered themselves one of the 10 northern tribes, where did they go back to? Well, they went back to the land, you see, that they understood to be their tribal allotment going all the way back to Abraham, right? But they nonetheless have not completely moved away from this notion that, oh yeah, remember David, Saul, Solomon, Rehoboam, Jeroboam. Okay, well, we can't go. So if you were a Samaritan or the descendant of a Samaritan who had been taken captive by the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians, and then you got released and you were allowed to go back, so you can't go back to Judea. You've got to go back to Samaria. That's where you have to go back to. So after they were released and allowed to go back, and went back and repopulated Samaria, and once again, now mixed in with some of the foreigners that are there, they actually built their own temple. They built an alternate temple to the one in Jerusalem, and the alternate temple that they built was on Mount Gerizim, right? Now, Mount Gerizim, if you'll remember, is the site where Moses divides up the tribes and has half of them stand in front of Mount Ebal and half of them stand in front of Mount Gerizim, and they hurl blessings and cursings back and forth at each other at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, right? So Mount Gerizim is where they built this alternative temple, specifically and deliberately as an alternative to the temple in Jerusalem, so that they could worship there. They could go to this temple for their pilgrimage festivals, and not go to the temple in Jerusalem, because they believed they shouldn't, couldn't, wouldn't, all that stuff, right? Now, Samaria, the other major city of Samaria is Shechem, and Mount Gerizim is actually closer to Shechem. They're about 25 miles apart, Samaria being a little, about 25 miles north of Shechem, and they're not in an exact straight line. They're a little bit off. Shechem is a little bit further to the east. So Samaria is about 25 miles northwest of Shechem. And Shechem is significant as well. Even though I want to focus on the city of Samaria, Shechem is significant. I already mentioned that's where Joseph's bones were buried, right? Also, this is the first place, Shechem is the first location that Abraham offered sacrifices in the promised land, right? Okay. Then, like I said, it's where Moses commanded the tribes of Israel to shout blessings and cursings at each other in front of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, right? It's also where Shechem is also where the northern kingdom declared their independence from Judah and Jerusalem, right? I already mentioned they built a rival temple there. I already mentioned earlier that nearby Shechem, nearby Mount Gerizim, is a village called Sychar, which is outside of Shechem, which is where Jesus met the Samaritan woman at the well. Now, here's another piece of trivia, but it is important to the whole God Save the King story, which is that the ridge road or ridge route goes through Samaria and Shechem. And this was, according to Josephus, the most common route for people to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem. They would take the ridge route, even though it went through Samaria. Now, some did take the effort to go around, right? But according to Josephus, the most common methodology that people would use to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem was they'd go right down the ridge road. It's also known as the Way of the Patriarchs. It's mentioned many times in scripture, okay, called the Way of the Patriarchs. And so therefore, part of what that tells us is that most likely this is the road that Joseph and Mary would have taken. Okay, the ridge route itself does not actually run through Nazareth proper, but it runs nearby Nazareth. It's maybe no more than about 8 to 10 miles from Nazareth is where they could pick up the ridge route, and then from there they could take the ridge route all the way to Jerusalem, all the way to Bethlehem. So that, helps us understand that it's highly probable that that is the route that Joseph and Mary took. It's very, and especially given the fact that she was pregnant, right? Not all that pregnant. I've mentioned in other episodes that I firmly believe that she was no more than 4 months maximum, probably only about 3 months pregnant when they actually made the journey. She was not 9 months pregnant like we see in the traditional version of the nativity stories. Okay. Now this is where it starts to really get interesting, because this is the part of the history of the region of Samaria, the city of Samaria, and then the city of Shechem, and the alternate temple that we haven't heard, right? And that's because it might be, here you go, it might be implied in Scripture, but it's not explicit. And therefore, it's a prime example of, well, the ancient writer and the ancient audience probably knew this, therefore they could imply it in their record, and they would be like, oh, yeah, sure, I get it, I understand, right? Whereas a modern reader without that cultural context, we're going to miss it. Unfortunately, we are going to miss it. So let me go over some very interesting facts about Mount Gerizim, about Shechem, and about Samaria in particular. We're really focusing on the city of Samaria in particular, but the whole region has some very interesting history that helps provide historical and cultural context to God Save the King and to the Roman Chronicle of God Save the King. Very, very, very interesting. Okay. So as I mentioned, bought by King Omri in the 9th century, pretty sure 9th century, right? He builds his new capital there. Late 8th century, like in the 720s BC is when the Assyrians come through, conquer Samaria, take captives. Then 100 years later, you get the Babylonian Empire conquers the Assyrians. Then you get, roughly 70 years after that is when the Persians conquer the Babylonians and release many of the Hebrew captives, allow them to go back. But if you were one of the Assyrians, or I should properly say a descendant of the Assyrian, I said that wrong. Correction. If you were from Samaria, or more properly, a descendant of the captives taken from Samaria by the Assyrians. There we go. Let's get that straight. If you were a descendant of one of the Samaritans taken captive by the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians, and then the Persians conquer the Babylonians, when the Persians released the Hebrews from Mesopotamia, if you were of Samaritan or one of the other, the 10 tribes that comprised the northern kingdom, you're not going to go back to Judea and Jerusalem, most likely. Now, you might, okay, you might have disguised yourself, lied about your tribal affiliation, and gone back to Jerusalem. But most likely, you went back to Samaria because then you could be true to your tribal affiliation, et cetera, right? So it was during the Persian period that they built the rival temple, right? And then the Greeks conquer the Persians. Now, during the Greek period, Samaria was largely autonomous, but not completely, because they were partially dependent upon the Seleucid Empire, as a vassal state. They had to pay tribute to the Seleucid Empire, and there you go, right? Now, remember from our other lessons, the fact that the Seleucid Empire demanded the Hellenization of their conquered areas. So they are pushing influence on Samaria just like they are on Judea and Jerusalem. And this means you have people that are starting to adopt these Greek cultural components. You got a lot of Jews that are saying, no, we won't. No, we won't change. No, we won't adapt. We won't adopt new cultural practices. But you also had a lot that were. So the general understanding is that it's usually the cities. It's usually the larger cities that fall prey to these foreign cultural influences, right? So that appears to be the case again, this time, that it's the city of Samaria, not so much Shechem. Interesting, right? That Samaria becomes much more Hellenized in general, okay? Much more than Shechem, which remained much more pious or devout to their, key though, to their version of Judaism. Not to Judea, Jerusalem-centered Judaism, but to Samaritan-centered Judaism at Shechem, which was just to the slightly to the, Shechem is in the valley between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, right? So Shechem is right there, right? So it's in the shadow of Mount Gerizim, and the temple was apparently on Mount Gerizim. Now, it was destroyed, therefore, and archaeologically, they believe they have found it, but there's just really not much there. There's not much to see, okay? So that brings us to, moving forward, right, from the taken captive by the Assyrians, Babylonians conquer the Assyrians, Persians conquer the Babylonians, Persians let the Jews go. So now they go back to Judea. They also go back to Samaria. And during the Persian period, they build this rival temple. Then the Greeks take over from the Persians. The Greeks enforce Hellenism on Samaria in addition to Judea. And apparently the city of Samaria starts to become much more Hellenized than Shechem, which remains more observant of their version of Northern Kingdom Judaism, right? Well, then what happens next? What's the next big piece of the puzzle that comes along historically is the Maccabean Revolt. Now, the Maccabean Revolt went out from Judea and Jerusalem, not from Samaria. Okay, the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, two very closely interrelated names, not 100% identical, but close, right? Started as the Maccabees, and then their descendants were known as the Hasmoneans. They're the ones that led the revolt against the Seleucid Empire. So it was the kingdom of Judea that was south of Samaria that won its independence. Samaria didn't necessarily win its independence from the Seleucid Empire in the Maccabean revolt. I'm splitting hairs, right? They didn't win their independence from the Greeks. It was the Maccabeans that won their independence from the Greeks. But the Maccabeans dynamic, the paradigm, was that they were going to restore the Davidic kingdom. And the Davidic kingdom, would of course include Samaria and Galilee. Very, 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 very interesting, right? So now when the Maccabees won their independence, they didn't win it overnight, okay? Sometimes when we tell the story, it sounds like they won their independence overnight, and that is not actually what happened. It actually took about 20 years. They initially remained a vassal of the Seleucid Empire, and then it was the first three, Maccabean rulers that operated in conjunction with the Seleucids, and then eventually were able to break away and declare complete independence from the Seleucid Empire. So there was a time there when there was a treaty agreement. This is very interesting. There were treaty agreements between the Seleucids and the Maccabees, right? And under the second Maccabean leader, Jonathan Appius, under Jonathan, it was agreed as part of the treaty, here you go, very interesting, that parts of Samaria were transferred to Judean control. Oh, isn't that interesting? Especially if you're a Samaritan. Because if you're a Samaritan and you live in a part of your region that you're a vassal state of the Seleucids, and the Hasmoneans have won their independence, the Maccabees have won their independence, and now there's a treaty between the Maccabees and the Seleucids, and they just go, oh yeah, we'll give you a chunk of Samaria. We'll give it to you, right? How are you going to look at that, right? So this is another poke in the eye from a Samaritan perspective of why they don't like Judeans and people from in and around Jerusalem. They already broke away several hundred years earlier, and now they're going through another version of, they think that Judea and Jerusalem is trying to dominate them. See, because they weren't, I don't think they were asked in the treaty, in other words, okay? And remember that the Maccabees want to restore the whole kingdom. So they've got their eye on Samaria anyway. They want to bring Samaria back into the fold, and frankly, they kind of don't really care how. Right? That's something we see under the Maccabees that is a little disconcerting, because we find them militarily conquering their neighboring states, right? They did it to Samaria. They did it to Idumea. They did it to Galilee. They militarily conquered these areas to bring them back under control of, what they consider to be a united, Jewish state. Very interesting. So under John Hyrcanus, who was a couple generations after Jonathan Appius, John Hyrcanus invades Samaria, and he conquers Samaria, and get ready, he destroyed Samaria and Shechem and the temple. He burns them all to the ground. 2 whole cities and the temple destroyed by John Hyrcanus. See, so this is his idea of bringing the Samaritans into the fold. So this really informs us even more about how, when we read in Jesus's time during his earthly ministry, let alone, during when he was born, but especially during his earthly ministry, that, there was a lot of antagonism with the Samaritans. And that's because there has been this ongoing record of antagonism. It wasn't just a one-time thing in the past, right? This is ongoing. See, so now Samaria, the central region of Israel, now falls under Hasmonean jurisdiction, and it remains under Hasmonean jurisdiction until Pompey, the Roman general Pompey, conquers Judea in 63 BC. So now it's under Roman control, even though it's still under Judean control, because the further descendants of the Hasmoneans, because remember when Pompey conquers Jerusalem, the high priest at the time was Aristobulus, right? When Alexandra Salome, the queen of Israel, died in 67, her oldest son, Hyrcanus, becomes high priest first, but he's immediately attacked by his little brother, Aristobulus, who then he becomes high priest. They go back and forth several times, but when Pompey shows up in 63, it's Aristobulus who is, I don't think Hyrcanus got it back yet, right? I think that was actually Pompey who did it. Aristobulus is the high priest. Both Aristobulus and Hyrcanus try to bribe Pompey. Pompey initially picked Aristobulus, but then Aristobulus tried to double-cross Pompey. Pompey didn't like it, so then he picked Hyrcanus instead. So now Hyrcanus is the high priest and ethnarch of Judea, but they consider themselves as having jurisdiction over Samaria and Galilee and Idumea. They believe they're in control of the whole thing, even though now all of them are under the Romans, okay? Well, there was a general under Pompey whose name was Gabinius, and Gabinius was an extraordinarily talented builder. He was assigned to be the governor of Roman Syria during a period of that time, and he engaged in rebuilding projects to restore the cities that had been destroyed. And guess which one was high on his list? He rebuilt Samaria. Very interesting. So now Samaria has an extraordinarily strong Roman influence as well, because it was rebuilt by a very talented Roman builder and governor named Gabinius. Very, very, very interesting here, right? And that would have been like between about 57 and 55 BC is when Gabinius would have rebuilt Samaria. Interesting, right? Now, remember that Herod would have been born in about 71 BC. So when Gabinius is rebuilding Samaria, that means Herod is, 14, 15, 16 years old, right? Hyrcanus is in charge. He is the ethnarch and the high priest. And Herod's father is Hyrcanus's prime minister, right? And therefore he is raising his sons, Faisal and Herod and Joseph, in the Judean court and training them to serve in the Judean court. Okay. And so then if you fast forward a few more years, you get to 48/47 BC. That's when Julius Caesar defeats Pompey. Pompey escapes to Egypt. Pompey gets assassinated. Caesar comes to Egypt. Caesar gets attacked by one of the Ptolemies, who is in a civil war with his sister Cleopatra over control of Egypt. Caesar actually gets surrounded. Reinforcements come in an end run around the Mediterranean. They pick up a contingent of 3,000 Judean cavalry under the leadership of Antipater. Herod's father. They fight at the Battle of the Nile. They defeat the Egyptians. Cleopatra becomes the client queen of Egypt under Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar awards Antipater, Herod's father, Roman citizenship, and then Antipater appoints his oldest son, Faisal, governor of Jerusalem. He appoints his second son, Herod, governor of Galilee in roughly 47, 46 BC. That makes Herod 24 or 25 years old when he becomes governor of Galilee. Okay. Now, when you fast forward about 3, 4, 5, 6 years, Antigonus, who was the son of Aristobulus, who had been taken captive initially by Pompey, escapes and comes back and starts raising trouble. And he starts fomenting a lot of trouble in where? In Samaria, of course, right? So Herod has to take his army to Samaria and reinstate the peace. It's hard to track all of the battles because Herod eventually does defeat Antigonus in direct conflict, okay? But I don't think that's quite yet. I think that's a couple more years down the line. But the point being is that Herod and Antigonus are definitely antagonists at this time, and it's because Herod restores peace in Samaria, right, that he is hailed as a hero, right? He is actually very popular right about then because he restores peace, right? Now, the people also very quickly realized that they remembered that he was an Idumean and his popularity kind of drifted back and forth. But this was a very turbulent time in the early 40s BC because Herod's father was also assassinated about that time. And now there's all this turmoil, and Faisal and Herod have to rise up and become the leaders and take their father's place, right? And then in 40 BC, that's when the Parthians invade. Hyrcanus and Faisal have to go to the Parthians to negotiate. Herod stays in reserve in case everything goes sideways, which it does, okay? He goes to Petra, Masada, then Petra, then Alexandria, then Rome. And that's when he's in Rome is when he is appointed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. He goes back to Judea with the Roman army to help him, and he reconquers Judea. But he doesn't just reconquer Judea, he reconquers Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. Because once again, that's the mindset, is that because he thinks he's an extension of the Hasmoneans, right? Because by this point now he's got a Hasmonean wife, right? So he's just an extension of the Hasmonean dynasty because he's got a Hasmonean wife. So he reconquers all of it, right? And so now once again, Samaria is under Hasmonean, actually Herodian dominion now. And here's the funny thing. Herod, because he is not a Judean, actually manages to persuade the Samaritans that they actually have a lot in common and that they can trust him. Okay? So what does Herod do? But Herod begins investing in Samaria. That's actually where he spends a lot of his time in his early career, is not in Jerusalem, but in Samaria, and he begins investing in Samaria, and Samaria actually begins to prosper, right? Now, make no mistake, Herod was a tyrant. Herod absolutely utilized confiscatory taxes, but Herod also understood that you can't tax your people into oblivion. They've got to be able to pay their taxes, right? So it's this interesting balancing act between you've got to bring prosperity to the country so that you can tax them heavily. You can't destroy the country and have it be, you know, no prosperity, be, what's the word I'm looking for? Impoverished. You can't have an impoverished country and then tax it into oblivion. You have to have a prosperous country so that you can tax it heavily so that you can enrich yourself. See? Very different perspective. I think a lot of modern politicians could learn that lesson. It's like, hey, you want to tax the heck out of us? Then make us prosperous, right? Don't tax the heck out of us and then expect, when we have less money that we're going to be excited about it, right? No, but if you bring prosperity, yeah, the people might grumble, but it's like, well, whew, wow, at least I had the money to pay my taxes, right? I'm making more money than I've ever made in my life. I'm paying more taxes than I've ever paid in my life, but, okay. So it's a very, very different perspective. So, but this was how Herod did things, okay? He wanted to make Israel a prosperous nation so that he could enrich himself, right? And he started in Samaria, of all places. Now, if you fast forward about 10 years, actually 10 years, you fast forward about 10 years from when Herod became the sole ruler, the client king of Roman Judea. 10 years later is when Octavian finally defeats Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. That's actually in 31 BC. But then in 27 BC is when he gets the title Augustus, and he is the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He is the emperor, okay? Imperator. He is the emperor. And in one of his first official acts, right, he actually gives Samaria to Herod. Now, Herod had been administrating it default because he believes that's part of the Hasmonean kingdom and things like that. But you got to remember that Gabinius had rebuilt it, and Judea, Samaria, and Galilee are now all client states, with Herod overseeing all of them to a degree. But Augustus officially bestows Samaria on Herod and says, you are officially, unequivocally in charge of Samaria. So he engages in another rebuilding project and beautifies Samaria extensively. He builds a temple to Augustus, a temple dedicated to Augustus, and he renames the city Sebast. And Sebast is simply the Greek equivalent of Augustus. So he names the city for Augustus. There is a Roman temple dedicated to Augustus in the city. He's running it as a Roman city for the Romans. So the point being is that you've got a functional Roman city. Now, it's populated by a lot of Samaritans who are half Jews, but they get along with Herod to a large degree because he's helping prosper them, and it's agricultural. He prospers their crops, and he populates the city with about 6,000 or 7,000 people that are loyal to him, and helps them start their crops and everything like that. So one last piece of information, and then we're going to summarize and wrap up here, is that the region of Samaria and the city of Samaria in particular, okay, probably worship the goddess Kor, okay, which she was the goddess of agriculture. Not surprisingly. So this would have been another very confusing element in the mind of a devout Jew, that, the Samaritans, well, they're half Jews, and they had an alternate temple, and now they're in league with Augustus and Herod, and they're worshiping Kor and all. I mean, what a mess. And so what a profound influence on our story and understanding who Herod was and what he was like. And we'll wrap up here, which is that now if you fast forward to the end of his life, and you fast forward to about 4 BC, okay? And that's a corrected date. Traditional date is 7 BC. I believe it's off by 3 years. This is when Herod executes his 2 sons by Mariamne, Alexander and Aristobulus, for plotting to kill them, right? Now, there is a trial at Beirut, all right? Berytus, okay? A trial at Berytus overseen by the Roman governor of Syria, Saturnius. And what does Herod do when he gets his guilty verdict? He has Alexander and Aristobulus transported to Sebaste, where he has them executed, and he has them strangled, which is a form of Roman execution. See, so the point of all this is you've got extraordinary Roman cultural influence going on right next to the Judean influence, the Samaritan, the Galilean, the Canaanite, the Syrian, all of it. You've got all these different cultural influences all going on at the same time. So this is just me trying to help provide some of this historical and cultural background so that we can get a better picture of what this really would have looked like. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to wrap it up. My name is Tim Kies. You have been watching God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. God save the King.